Welcome once again to Plan to Protect with Melodie Bissell, the safest podcast on the internet. My name's Joshua Bissell, and I'm the editor of this weekly podcast where we tackle topics around abuse prevention and vulnerable sector protection. We're so glad to have you join us this week. Thank you for watching our podcast. If you haven't already done so, please hit that subscribe button down below and hit that share link and tell your community, your team, all about the podcast. This week, we're giving a preview of our Serious About Safety Facebook Masterclass, starting on February 1st, 2021. We'd love to have you join us for that. Melodie's talking all about best practices, but also what happens when the ideal situation isn't what you're facing. What to do when there's a complex or difficult situation. When you're not sure how to apply your policies and procedures. Melodie's got some phenomenal content for us this week. Let's get into it.
Hello. So we finished a series on tips for 2021, tips on being successful this year with your abuse prevention and safeguarding strategy. Today, I just want to talk to you a little bit about this whole topic of best practices and when best practices don't work. I'm doing that because I really want to extend an invitation to you to join us next week, if you're listening to this live or you're listening to this when it's posted, to join us for our upcoming series about safety. This is a course we offer 2 or 3 times a year, so you can always check out our schedule on plantoprotect.com and find out when the next series about safety is. But next week, we are going to be talking about when best practices don't always fit a situation. So today I'm just going to give you a little bit of a teaser of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be unpacking this a lot more next week. And I just once again want to welcome you. Thank you for listening in to our weekly podcast. If you're new to listening, we talk about best practices on safeguarding children, youth, and vulnerable adults. We talk about research on how to prevent abuse from happening, how to prevent injury and harm, how to safeguard your organization and those that you serve. At Plan to Protect, we often talk about best practices, but what happens when those best practices just do not fit? We talk about policies and procedures often on our podcast and in our training. Policies are often considered and should be emphatic statements that are put in place by your leadership and your board. They're emphatic statements as to what must be done. So the language of a policy is often must, require, we will do this. So they're very emphatic statements, and leadership and the board have put these policies in place, meaning everyone must follow those policies. Alternatively, a procedure is how the policies will be done. Let me give you an example. A policy is we must take attendance every time a program or an event is happening. That would be a policy. It's put in place by the board, leadership. We must take attendance. A procedure would be how you're going to do that policy. So a procedure would be written, attendance will be taken using KidCheck, and the data will be stored on the cloud. So that would be how the policy will be applied and adhered to. Children's programming might use KidCheck. Youth programming might use a manual system, but attendance must be taken. How the attendance will be taken would be a procedure. Best practices are used to maintain quality, part of quality management. They're a best practice or a means of adhering to quality, often as an alternative to mandatory legislation. Best practices also are research-based. Best practices are often found within accredited management standards, such as ISO 9000. You'll find best practices in nursing, best practices in manufacturing, and best practices in quality control. Best practices are similar to standard of care. Standard of care is by necessity a flexible standard determined by speculating what an average and reasonable person would do or not do in that same situation. There are best practices with ratios. There are best practices with supervision. Best practices in avoiding isolation. The 2-adult rule is not a law. It would be a policy that your leadership and board may put in place. It would be the standard of care, what reasonable individuals and organizations would do in a similar situation. Now, best practices are ideal in a simple design of a program or an event. We all are aware, though, that when caring for the vulnerable sector, the simple doesn't always happen. An example of this would be a best practice would be to have 2 screened, unrelated adults in every classroom. In our Plan to Protect manual, we have stated this as a best practice for a policy statement. However, we know when you're working with the vulnerable sector, children, youth, and vulnerable adults, accidents, injuries, crises can come up. We also know that when you're working with volunteers, a volunteer may not show up when they're anticipated to be there. If a best practice can't be adhered to in the Plan to Protect manual, we've provided you some examples of how exceptions should be handled. In the late 1990s, Dave Snowden developed the Connery Framework. The Connery Framework is a sense-based framework. Yes, he addresses that in the simple events and activities, in the simple decision-making, best practices should apply. These are obvious situations when you would sense what is taking place. You would categorize this as an event or a program that we are holding. So best practices will apply and you will respond with those best practices. But what happens for those complicated or complex situations that can occur when you're working with the vulnerable sector? What Dave Snowden with the Connery model identified is that if you do not apply best practices or good practices, when you don't incorporate sense and response or probe into the situation, you can find yourself in complete disorder or in a chaotic mess. I can remember a youth pastor reaching out to me and telling me that they weren't going to use Plan to Protect anymore. He was driving to an event. There was a terrible lightning storm. And as he was driving to the event, he saw one of his youth walking on the side of the road in the middle of the storm. He called me and said, we're not going to use Plan to Protect anymore because it doesn't work in some situations. You see, this youth pastor found himself in either a complicated or a complex situation where the best practice didn't always fit. So let's unpack this a little bit and let's talk about when best practices don't fit complicated and complex situations. Remember, we want to avoid complete disorder and we want to avoid a chaotic mess. In the situation of the youth pastor driving to program, seeing one of his youth on the side of the road being impacted by lightning and thunder and rain and wind, and feeling that his best practices of avoiding isolation by inviting a student into his car alone would not fit the situation. Instead of completely throwing out best practices or good practices or even sense in a situation such as a complicated situation like this, what we would have advised this youth pastor to do is sense what is happening, what is the greatest danger, analyzing that situation. This young woman could be hit by lightning. She is exposed to the elements. In this situation, the best practice would not fit to avoid isolation. Rather, using sense and analyzing the situation, the youth pastor should have responded by inviting the student into his car, encouraging her to call her parents while she's in the car to say that she is safe, that she's in the car of the youth pastor, and that she was checking in with her parent. When the youth pastor got to church, at his earliest convenience, he should have filled out an incident report form stating why the best practice didn't win and how he applied good practices of having the student call her parent from the car and that he was filling out an incident report form. So he used a good practice instead of a best practice. At Plan to Protect, we often talk about good, better, best, and bad. We want to avoid complete disorder. We want to avoid the chaotic, and we want to either apply best practices for simple events and programs, and in the case that doesn't happen, to apply a good practice. A good practice in this situation was calling a parent on the phone, inviting that parent to be on the phone when they were in the car, and to fill out an incident report form. So they're being accountable to leadership. But what happens in a complex situation? In a complex situation, we are called in this situation to probe initially. What is transpiring? To ask questions, to sense how to move forward and to respond appropriately with the information you have gleaned. Last week, I heard of a story of a global trip where two minors were traveling to meet up with a group of other students in a developing world country. They had a layover halfway through their trip. One of the minors discovered on the layover that her passport had gone missing. Either she had left it in the seat on the plane of the first leg of the trip, or someone had stolen her passport. When it was discovered that she had lost her passport, the coordinators were alerted to the fact that she was not going to be allowed onto the plane to finish off her trip. In this situation, it was complex. Best practices were not able to be followed. Even good practices in this situation caused it not easy to analyze the situation and then respond. Instead, coordinators had to probe and discover what the country where the girls were at would allow them to do. They were able to contact the embassy, and yes, the embassy would be able to prepare and provide a new passport, but that would require the minors leaving the airport on their own to travel to the embassy. It seemed like the best case situation and scenario until they learned that the airport police would not allow them to leave the airport without a passport in hand. This was a very complex situation. Best practices and good practices just did not fit this situation. So, again, the coordinators had to go back to the drawing board and once again probe how could they respond. What was the best they could do in this complex situation? Ended up that one of the girls had to return to North America and the other girl went on her own the last leg of the journey to meet up with her team. In situations like this, the Connery Framework states that this results in emerging practices. You're writing the practice as you live it out. The more guiding principles that you can provide in situations like this, in complex situations, the better. In all cases, you want to avoid complete disorder and you want to avoid the chaotic. Unfortunately, if you don't invest in professional development of your leaders, of your directors, your staff, and your volunteers, you will find yourself in complete disorder or in a chaotic mess. We want to really encourage you to invest in the professional development of your team members. That's why we not only provide our podcast and our special interest webinars at Plan to Protect, but we also provide you our Serious About Safety Masterclass that we offer 2 or 3 times a year. Serious About Safety is a tremendous opportunity to get all your team together to talk about best practices, good practices, how to deal with complicated and complex situations. To date, we have offered 2 Serious About Safety masterclasses. This coming Monday, we'll be offering our 3rd. And this time we are going to go deeper into understanding what some of those good practices are compared to best practices and how to probe and analyze and respond in complex situations. Hopefully, you won't find yourself in that situation very often. We also want to encourage you to invest in leadership's professional development with our certification courses. We have 5 certification courses that Plan to Protect: Administrator Leader Level 1, Administrator Leader Level 2, Train the Trainer Level 1, Train the Trainer Level 2, and Crisis Response and Management. Those 5 certification courses are professional development for your leaders. We encourage you to have certified trainers on your team, certified administrators on your team, and certified crisis responders on your team. Take time now to register for next week's course or the upcoming course for Serious About Safety. Once you're in the Facebook group, extend invitation to all of your team members and your board members. You won't want them to miss out on learning not only best practices, but also good practices so that you know how to deal with complicated and complex situations. Looking forward to you joining us. It's a great opportunity for us to get to know you and for you to get to know the whole Plan to Protect team. Thanks so much for joining us today. See you online next week. Take care. Bye.